Hello and welcome to China Dispatches, a European Chamber podcast that shares underground insights from European business leaders and experts on doing business in China. I'm your host, Gao Rui. In the last episode, I was joined by three of my Chamber colleagues in Beijing. We talked about some of the most memorable keywords from 2024. In this episode, we're going to discuss what we think were the most overhyped and the most underappreciated things of the past year. Finally, we will also give our projections on what to look forward to in 2025. First, I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, starting from Mariann.
I'm Mariann, Policy and Communications Manager here at the Chamber's Beijing office. I usually work on reports and our media communications, and also I work on the China Shortcuts podcast with you.
Hi, I'm Ester. I look after European affairs, that is the Chamber's overall engagement with EU institutional stakeholders, and I also support the implementation of an EU-funded project, the EU SME Center.
My name's Hayward. I'm the General Manager of the Beijing chapter. I'm also Director of Communications for the European Chamber and I'm working on all our reports and media statements. I come on podcasts when you don't have anybody else.
First question for all of you is, what was the most overhyped thing in 2024?
I think the third plenum was a bit overhyped because there was a lot of expectation. Of course, the fact that the date kept pushed ahead and we didn't know when it was going to happen. And then when finally it happened and we got the decision in the end.
From July 15th to 18th, the 20th CPC Central Committee convened its third plenary session in Beijing.
There clearly was some issues behind the scenes with the meeting being pushed. Then when we saw the outcome, basically just a reiteration of areas of policy focus that we've heard before. Nothing really groundbreaking. And I think for European business, often we're looking for exactly these kind of events to see what's going to come out, to give us an idea of what direction things are going to go in so companies can start to adjust or make plans to mitigate. Even to the point where the language that came out of I think it's called the resolution, not the decision, was repeating the idea that we have to create a decisive role for the private sector in the allocation of resources, which we heard back in 2013. And also the fact that at the same time, SOEs are expected to play a much bigger role in the economy. So there was that fundamental contradiction. So I just think that there was nothing really in there. It was just kind of a, reiteration.
What's your choice?
I would say that my most overhyped thing of the year is tariffs, and in particular, the focus that China has put on the EU's EV tariffs. If we talk about tariffs in general, I think that it's important to look at the bigger picture. And if we take a look at Global Trade Alert's database on harmful trade interventions, in 2023-2024, tariffs were only 6% of the overall harmful trade interventions. Actually, if we should be focusing on something, that's subsidies, because subsidies represented almost 60% of the share of harmful interventions. And if we look at the different plans and industrial strategies that are being drawn up in key economies, we can probably expect to see more of those.
Okay, what about Gao?
I think China's visa-free policies that have been extended to more countries and also in terms of the time that they'll be applicable for has been overhyped. I think, first of all, it's important, definitely. It was one of the issues that was mentioned as part of the State Council's 24 measures that came out in August last year. So following through and implementing this is absolutely important and has a certain level of significance.
China recorded over 29 million inbound foreign visits in the first 11 months this year. That's over 86% increase compared to last year.
I think the overhyped aspect of it is the impact that this will actually have on business and increasing foreign direct investment. So we know from our members that they obviously welcome this. It does allow executives from headquarters to come and visit China at short notice, which is convenient, particularly after what happened with COVID, when there was that huge gap that opened up where there's no business travel really taking place. It's been very important for them to come here to reconnect with their teams, to find out what's going on the ground, which is important. You don't want to just keep reading about China in the newspapers. So all of that is extremely important. But I think it's just one initial step in terms of what needs to be done to rebuild investor confidence and to actually start to turn the tide and get people to start investing more. So good start, but we need to focus much more on some of the fundamental structural issues: level playing field, market access, access to procurement. These are the kind of things that are really going to make a difference if China is to start to increase foreign direct investment.
We have an episode on the topic of inbound travel recovery and visa-free policies. We invited Chair of Aviation and Aerospace Working Group and also a colleague of the Chamber to be speakers of that topic. If you are interested, you can go back and listen to that. Next question. What was the most underappreciated thing in 2024?
So I think one thing that we have looked into quite in detail in the past years, also as part of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on foreign nationals living in China. So of course we spoke about the foreign exodus that it resulted in. And in the following years, both in the BCS and in other publications, we mentioned how increasingly challenging it is for our members to attract foreign talent to their China operations. Also, one other aspect of this was that it is not just that China is becoming less appealing for foreign nationals to come to work here and live here, but also that China experience is no longer expected from HQs as part of someone's portfolio for further career development. I think that we looked at this a lot, so much so that we somewhat overlooked another aspect when it comes to talent attraction, and that was the domestic talent attraction and what kind of domestic talent foreign companies have access to in China. And one of the key findings of the report that we are currently working on and we're going to launch at the beginning of next year is that top graduates in China are no longer favoring jobs at foreign companies. Used to be very appealing to top graduates before, but now they see more stability in jobs in government or at SOEs, which is obviously a problem for foreign companies who are now increasingly competing with the private companies in China for talent. But another aspect of this is that government and SOEs are looking for talent that doesn't have experience at foreign companies, preferably not even foreign studies experience. So that leads to a kind of segregation of the talent pool. What it means is that especially the younger generations working at foreign companies, they will have a background from foreign companies. So they go from foreign company to foreign company, whereas people working for government, people working for SOEs, they will have that background, the government and SOE background. And some of our members are already noticing this as an issue, as a challenge for them to bridge that gap between the regulator and their own operations, but even more so the gap between the regulator and their headquarters, because also this talent pool within China will be very local, meaning that a lot of their local staff will not have HQ experience either. So lacking HQ experience on the one hand and lacking government or SOE experience on the other makes it very challenging for an increasing number of our members to efficiently communicate between the two and resolve issues and advocate in an efficient way.
I just want to pick up on what Mariann was saying. And for me, one of the most underappreciated things of this year has been the dynamics of siloing in general. Going back to when we did our report on decoupling in early 2021, we put forward the idea that decoupling was basically in the Trumpian sense. What he was pushing for at that time was to essentially compel, coerce, encourage, however you want to put it, US companies to leave China and to reshore. So in other words, just to separate completely from the Chinese economy. What we observed at that time is that there was a kind of decoupling going on. But what it actually entailed was that companies were still, and this applies to our members very much so, companies are still very much attracted by the allure of the China market, that they're not willing to leave. They're not willing to follow that kind of logic. They still want to be here. They still see enormous potential. But in order to do so, they're increasingly separating their China operations from the rest of the world. Now, some of this is driven by a kind of regulatory compliance issues. For example, there are companies that are localizing their IT and their data because of regulations in China that is basically steering them to do so. Localization of workforce has always been a trend in China. I mean, this is something that companies have always done in any market. They've always done it for commercial reasons. They have also localized R&D functions. They localize and onshore supply chains. And all of this follows a commercial logic, which is to do with efficiency, being closer to customers, being able to react more quickly. The siloing, however, so in terms of HR, means that you're starting to see actually a separation between staff on the ground in China and headquarters, which can result in a kind of breakdown in communications. Our members have reported that this dynamic has resulted in a slowdown of operations in general, inability to capitalize on investment decisions on the ground in China. And so just in general, there are difficulties with that gap opening up. But when you consider the implications of siloing of actual operations, R&D, so in other words, you're doing R&D in China for China, you're essentially cutting yourself off from global efficiencies, global economies of scale. In terms of IT infrastructure, you no longer are able to benefit from your global IT systems, which, while on the one hand it allows you to stay in the China market, to be here and to potentially build market share, what it means is that you are now reducing your own global competitiveness, because you're now competing against Chinese companies that can operate as fully global entities. They don't have the same restrictions in the rest of the world. And so I guess you could say that European companies and other foreign companies, that by doing so, by playing into this kind of siloing dynamic, are just making themselves less competitive in general. And I think that may be something that's not fully recognized in the business community yet, but definitely some of these messages are what we're going to be explaining with the launch of our report at the beginning of next year.
I mean, for me, 2024 has been full of headline figures, economic data. But what actually interested me was the social impact of China's economic slowdown, particularly the impact on public sentiment. And in this respect, we have a very interesting survey that was conducted at the end of 2023 by Professor Scott Rosell, which is based on a prior survey that Harvard professor Martin King had been conducting until 2014, and that was stopped. So we had quite a big gap on the data. But what's interesting is that the perceptions from surveyed individuals on why they are poor or why they are rich have changed drastically between 2014 and 2023. People don't think that they're poor because of lack of ability or education, which were the top issues indicated in 2014. In 2023, people think that they're poor because of unequal opportunity and an unfair economic system. Similarly, people don't think that they're rich anymore because of hard work or ability, which again were top responses back in 2014. People think that they're rich because of guanxi. And again, just sentiment on the opportunity to succeed is absolutely low compared to previous years. It's just people are less optimistic about their prospects in China. People are less optimistic about equal opportunity. That is quite relevant because that does impact individual behavior and consumer behavior and therefore, economic data.
Okay, let's look forward to 2025. What do you think people should keep their eyes on?
Definitely, US administration will be something that both EU institutions, Chinese government, and companies will be watching out for. I mean, we've heard what President-elect Trump has mentioned about slapping tariffs on Chinese exports and, together with Canadian and Mexican exports.
The word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word. One of the most beautiful words I've ever heard. It's music to my ears. And it will not cause inflation, by the way.
So definitely this will be something to watch on the trade policy front. Personally, I'll be watching how the European Commission gets to work. particularly on the more than 200 points in the Draghi report that would contribute to enhancing European competitiveness. And finally, I'll be watching the dynamics in the member states, particularly looking at the establishment of a new government in France and the German elections.
Unfortunately, I have to agree that the main thing to look at for next year will be Trump. But just to sort of put a different slant on it, I think it's important to look how the EU positions itself, if you like, in the center of this relationship. The first time he came in 2016, there was actually quite a lot of discussion within the chamber at that point when he started swinging his tariff sledgehammer, that maybe this would allow the EU and the China to become closer, that they would kind of fill a vacuum as, the US went about very much a America first kind of policy, which is something that he appears to be going to pursue again over the next 4 years, and that this would allow the EU to find more opportunities for cooperation, collaboration with China. I think the reality played out somewhat differently. I mean, the one thing that we know that is predictable about Donald Trump is the unpredictability. And I think the fact that he was able to do so many disruptive things, they just proved such a distraction that actually it seemed that China ended up paying perhaps even more attention to the US at the expense of the EU. And it felt that the EU, with its very mature middle ground dialogue centric kind of approach, wasn't taken seriously because there was a noisier person in the room that was demanding the attention. So I think how the EU positions itself in this trilateral relationship over the coming year is going to be extremely important. And it maybe needs to look at a way to ensure that it is having its voice heard and its concerns taken more seriously. The hope is, of course, that it will allow the EU to build a stronger relationship with China. But I guess we'll find out.
We will. And one thing to watch out for as well will be how China approaches its relationship with Russia and its implicit or explicit support for Russia in the context of the Ukraine war.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that is also, again, unfortunately linked to Trump, as he has already indicated that he is less than enthusiastic of continuing to support Ukraine the way that the US has been doing so far. So that's going to be hugely important.
Yes, I agree with all of that, but I'm going to take it back from this very big macro angle to a very, very micro angle. And one of the things that I am quite curious to see is how maybe, I don't know if we're going to see actually a huge shift in the next year already, but there was one thing that I thought was interesting last year is to see the impact that the real estate crisis and basically the weak stock market had on a type of business model in China, which I think is quite unique, which is the type of membership fee-based services, which usually, I mean, at least in my experience, what is unique about it is that in China, people pay long-term memberships for services because that's usually how it is worth paying for, because it's going to be a bit cheaper if you pay for a membership for 1 year, 2 years, etc. And a lot of these types of businesses crumbled during the last couple of years. Of course, people understood this as a kind of a ripple effect still of COVID-19 and then lagging economic growth. But then more interestingly, what really played a part was that the way these businesses operate is that they gather money from the initial payments from members, and then they raise this capital and then they reinvest that into either real estate or stock markets. And then when that didn't work, these businesses fell apart. So what I'm interested to see is how this is going to change these types of business models, because that would then have a substantial impact on the service industry and how services are offered in China, and how that will have an impact then on consumer confidence, because this was definitely something that undermined consumer confidence when they got impacted by the fact that, the services they prepaid for just suddenly disappeared.
That's all for today. Thank you very much, Mariann, Esther, and Gao for joining. If you like our podcast, please subscribe to China Dispatches, recommend it to your colleagues and friends, and share it on social media. Also, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can find contact details in our show notes. This is Gao Rui from China Dispatches. Thanks for listening.